The Soviet project was born from the idea of forming a new society where all people were equal and could be afforded the opportunity to pursue dreams. In reality, this idea not only failed to materialize, but was corrupted and perverted in a state that eventually collapsed under the weight of numerous challenges. One of these internal rots was a corruption scandal which, when it broke open in 1982, shook the foundation of a republic and even the Union to its core. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at the impact of corrupt cotton in the Uzbek SSR. This is the Cold War. First, a little context. The 1980s was a tumultuous decade for the Soviet Union. It saw 3 successive first secretaries die in office, then a Chernobyl disaster almost poisoned half of the planet, and massive economic and political reforms which aimed to reinvigorate a stagnant nation. It is perhaps not surprising then that the seemingly less glamorous Uzbek Cotton Scandal, in which billions of rubles were stolen from the Soviet authorities, might not immediately come to mind as one of the most memorable low points. After all, everybody knows that the Soviet Union was corrupt, so who cares, right? But the oft-forgotten scandal was, at the time, an absolutely shocking revelation in Soviet society. It, in more ways than one, highlighted to the public for the first time the deep rot at the very heart of the Soviet state that would ultimately lead to its demise. So, how could a crop as seemingly harmless as cotton inflict so much damage on an international superpower, one with more nuclear weapons than the United States, no less? Why did it take place in Uzbekistan? How was it possible? And who was to blame? To understand the development of the Uzbek Cotton Scandal in full, it is perhaps best to start at the beginning to explore the Central Asian Republic's place in the empire as well as its economy. In the 1920s, Joseph Stalin, who was Lenin's Commissar for Nationalities, was put in charge of splitting up the mostly Islamic Central Asia into the various territories, which would then be integrated into the newly formed USSR. Of course, the boundaries Stalin created did not necessarily align with the actual ethnic and linguistic boundaries of the communities living there, not unusual in these events. But despite no neat and tidy divisions, the Uzbek Socialist Soviet Republic was nevertheless created on the 27th of October 1924 as a result of Stalin's decisions. Soon after, in May of the next year, the Uzbek SSR was formally integrated into the USSR. At this time, with the exception of a few nationalists who saw communism as a potential vehicle with which to modernize Central Asia, Communist Party affiliation in the region was extremely weak, so strengthening it became a key priority. During the 1930s, under the guidance of the Vozhd, the Communist Party of Uzbekistan was gradually purged of these more nationalist leaders, and various Uzbek technocrats were put in charge instead. Though the early Soviet policy of Goranizatsiya, or indigenization, upheld Uzbek linguistic rights and encouraged some forms of national expression, ultimately these had to be within the limits that Moscow dictated, and wholesale expressions of nationalism were not permitted. Despite this though, by the end of the 1930s, the Uzbek Communist Party was well consolidated. So, what was Uzbekistan's economic role in the USSR? Well, it would be no exaggeration to say that industry in Central Asia before the Soviets arrived was basically non-existent. That said, Moscow never really saw the region as a potential hub of industry. Rather, for the Soviets, Central Asia would be a hub of agriculture. Under Stalin, the Uzbek cotton industry thus began to take shape. In 1935, higher prices for the procurement and sale of cotton were introduced to encourage the industry's growth. The strategy worked, and prior to the German invasion of the USSR, Soviet cotton production sat at about 2.24 million tons per year. Though the Great Patriotic War would see cotton production decline in favor of food production, by 1960, cotton production had recovered and grown, with 4.29 million tons harvested, nearly doubling the amount produced before the war. Though this figure includes production from Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, as well as Uzbekistan, the numbers were still impressive, and Central Asia had established itself as a fruitful base for the USSR's agricultural needs. Now, as is so often the case, and as we have pointed out so many times, the death of Stalin in 1953, the subsequent rise of Khrushchev, and the processes of Destalinization that followed all had huge implications for the Uzbek SSR and how the center, Moscow, interacted with its subjects on the periphery. There were lingering questions about whether the Islamic heritage that characterized Central Asian societies was even compatible with communism, and the USSR accordingly faced criticism over its role in Central Asia at the infamous 1955 Bandung Conference in Sukarno's Indonesia, where the non-aligned movement was established. So, in this context, according to Dr. Riccardo Mario Cucciolla, quote, Tashkent, the center of Soviet Islam and the capital of the largest non-Slavic entity within the USSR, Uzbekistan, claimed the mantle of guidance of those third world and neighboring Muslim countries that were struggling to establish a modern identity and path to development in the post-colonial order. In response, Khrushchev eulogized the progress of these republics. He heralded them as a model for developing countries and burnished communism's anti-colonial credentials, thereby advancing the myth of internationalism, socialist progress, and the USSR under the banner of Druzhba Narodov, friendship of the peoples. This slogan was remarked on at the 21st CPSU Congress in 1959, later becoming a leitmotif in Soviet historiography and monuments. Think, for instance, of the Palace of the Friendship of Peoples in Tashkent, the same one we showcased in our previous video on Soviet architecture. As a result, the leader of Soviet Uzbekistan from 1955 to 1957, Nuretdin Mukhtinov, pushed Khrushchev and the Politburo on the importance of finding new allies in the Third World. He was later appointed as ambassador to Syria, and Uzbekistan took on a central role in the Soviets' Third World strategy. Nevertheless, amidst all of this, Khrushchev had developed a profound distrust not only of Mukhtinov, but also the leaders of the other Soviet republics in Central Asia. This was in large part due to their thriving cotton industries. Indeed, the post-war growth of the cotton industry exaggerated Khrushchev and the Politburo's expectations, and they thought that more could be done. They did not believe that the numbers Mukhtinov and other officials in Central Asia were reporting were high enough and expected more from the republics. In the meantime, another Uzbek politician, Sharaf Rashidov, had been slowly but surely ascending through the ranks of the Uzbek Communist Party. According to Dr. Cucciolla, Rashidov was an exemplar of how indigenization and the integration of local elites into the Soviet project was realized, while Dr. Edward Allworth claims that Rashidov wanted to be a total communist man. Rashidov was certainly not wasting any time in his pursuit of this. In 1950, Rashidov became chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of Uzbekistan. By 1956, he was a candidate member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and eventually in 1959, he became first secretary of the Communist Party of Uzbekistan. Amidst the atmosphere of distrust towards Central Asian republics under Khrushchev, Rashidov spotted that the best way to gain the Politburo's trust and remain in power was to curry favor with Moscow. This meant playing the game and going along with the demands of the party. When Rashidov came to power on the 15th of March 1959, he thus immediately instigated a purge of all the Uzbek Communist Party to fill the ranks with those who shared his vision and were willing to do what it took to gain Moscow's trust. As summed up by Professor Derek Peterson, the Uzbek Party understood that if they delivered the desired amount of cotton, or even exceeded procurement quotas, they would simultaneously gain favor in Moscow and acquire increased revenue. But the truth was that cotton production could only really increase with water that Uzbekistan did not have. It's important to bear in mind that cotton production is both extremely water intensive and highly damaging for soil, meaning that the more it's grown, the more water is needed to keep producing it. Still, in Moscow, the Politburo was considering increasingly ridiculous and disruptive plans for how they could ramp up cotton production in Uzbekistan. One plan, for example, involved diverting river water all the way from Siberia to cotton fields in Central Asia. Though this thankfully did not happen, something equally fateful for the ecology of the Uzbek SSR did take place. Circa 1960, the Sirdarya and Amudarya rivers, both of which fed the Aral Sea, were diverted to serve cotton production in Uzbekistan in the hope that this would contribute to growth. The effects of this, unsurprisingly, were catastrophic. Though we will explore the fate of the Aral Sea in more detail in a future video, it began to shrink almost immediately, and by the early 1980s, the sea had already halved in size. This not only destroyed the Uzbek and Kazakh SSR's once booming fishing industry in the Aral Sea region, but was also emblematic of Uzbekistan's burgeoning transformation into a cotton republic. Things were further complicated by the fact that the canals the Soviets built to feed the Uzbek cotton industry were mostly made of unlined sand, meaning that as much as 90% of the water flowing through them escaped before it actually reached the cotton fields in the first place. Still though, with Rashidov's rise to power, bringing with it an understanding that the Republic needed to dance to Moscow's tune, the stage was set for Uzbekistan's economy to become a complete cotton monoculture. However, Uzbekistan's increasing focus on cotton under Rashidov was just one part of the equation. Indeed, Khrushchev's demise in 1964 and Leonid Brezhnev's rise as his replacement brought with it further implications for Uzbekistan's cotton industry and Rashidov's rule of Uzbekistan more broadly. This is because, when Brezhnev came to power, he brought with him the idea of stability of cadres. This was essentially a reaction against all of the intrigue and personnel changes that had taken place under Stalin, but to an extent under Khrushchev as well. Under the stability of cadres, Republic leaders like Rashidov were afforded not only significant trust, but were also given wide-reaching powers to rule their republics as they saw fit. The way this worked is not dissimilar to the themes we covered in our previous video on the economy of the Georgian SSR. In effect, Brezhnev wanted men in charge that he could trust, but above all, that could maintain the stability and therefore the illusion of success of the Soviet economy. So, what were the wider effects of the stability of cadres doctrine? When considering this, it's really important to remember how the Soviet economy worked. To keep it super simple, production targets for goods and commodities were set in Moscow by the Central Plan, or Gosplan. The republics who produced the goods were then paid by the central authorities for the goods they produced, and the amount that they were paid varied depending on whether or not their targets were met, as well as the amount they had produced. As we mentioned earlier though, in the cotton industry, as well as others, there had been genuine growth since the end of the Great Patriotic War. There was therefore an expectation that the economy would keep growing indefinitely. But by the mid-1960s, growth had slowed down, partly because of the practical barriers like those in Uzbekistan's cotton industry, where there was simply not enough water to reasonably produce more cotton. Amid Cold War competition with the West, however, maintaining the illusion of economic growth was vital. Production targets therefore kept going up and up, putting regional and Republican leaders under increasing pressure to meet these targets. But how could they maintain industrial growth if it was physically impossible to actually meet the targets of the Central Plan? Well, the answer to that question for most Soviet politicians was, quite simply, to lie. Lying about industrial output quickly became commonplace, and with Brezhnev unwilling to fire people because of his belief in the stability of cadres, these lies were tolerated and arguably even encouraged. This was therefore one of the doctrine's main aspects. Its second key impact, however, was much more damaging and to a large degree set in motion the terminal decline of the Soviet state, corruption. Because leaders like Rashidov were lying about their industrial output across the entire USSR, they continued to receive money from the central authorities in Moscow. But now they were receiving money not just for goods they actually did produce, but also for the non-existent goods that they simply pretended they had produced in order to meet their unachievable production targets. And what happened to the cash for these non-existent goods? Well, we'll get into that, but the disparity between rhetoric and reality certainly created opportunities for powerful elites. It's also worth considering the extent to which Brezhnev knew what was going on. One particularly revealing instance tells you pretty much everything you need to know though. When Rashidov promised Brezhnev personally that he would aim to produce 5 million tons of cotton per year in the late 1970s, Brezhnev simply replied, "Round it off to 6 million, Saravchik." For Brezhnev then, it did not matter how corrupt you were or what you were doing, as long as you maintained the illusion of success, you were a good egg in his books. As summarized by historian Fred Coleman, Brezhnev was keeping, quote, his own Politburo in the dark so that it could not blame him for the building economic disaster. In effect, he was securing his own position at the expense of the nation's economic well-being. Now, turning back to Uzbekistan and its cotton industry, by the 1970s, things were well and truly booming under Rashidov, at least on the surface, and a cotton monoculture had become highly entrenched. Indeed, by the late 1970s, cotton accounted for 65% of the republic's entire output, and employed around 40% of the population. Moreover, Central Asia as a whole accounted for 95% of the entire USSR's cotton and fiber production. Simultaneously, the Soviets' approach to economics and Brezhnev's stability of cadres doctrine ensured that production targets for Uzbekistan's cotton industry kept growing, and so too did Rashidov's confidence in his republic's ability to achieve them. In 1980, for example, Rashidov announced that the republic would produce 6 million tons of cotton on its own, a record for the republic, and an improvement of over 500,000 tons from the harvest in 1970. Production figures of harvesting machines also increased from 44,000 units in 1975 to 55,000 in 1980, the biggest increase in any 5-year period from 1965 to 1984. This growth did, of course, come with consequences. Throughout this period, Uzbekistan was completely reliant on other republics for food, and, as we already mentioned, the Aral Sea region in the republic's west had been devastated. Meanwhile, though, the trust Brezhnev had in Rashidov meant that the Uzbek leader was free to develop a highly personalized regime around himself. High-ranking positions were given to his family and allies, and access to rare goods and opportunities became increasingly dependent on his whim. His economic success also made him a popular figure in Moscow, with Rashidov maintaining an excellent personal relationship with Brezhnev and receiving various awards for his achievements in Uzbekistan. These included, but were not limited to, 10 Orders of Lenin, an Order of the October Revolution, a Lenin Prize, and 2 Heroes of Socialist Labor medals. 1970s Uzbekistan was a place where it seemed like the good times would never end. But by this point, the corruption and lies upon which Brezhnev had built the USSR's political economy were an open secret and had become normalized. Indeed, by 1982, it was estimated that around 20 million Soviet citizens were engaged either full-time or part-time in corrupt activities. People's willingness to pretend that everything was fine would later be theorized as hypernormalization by the Russian anthropologist Alexei Yurchak. Everyone knew that the system didn't really work and was unsustainable, but imagining an alternative was impossible. One man, however, did imagine an alternative, Yuri Andropov. Andropov was the chairman of the KGB under Brezhnev from 1967 to 1982, and as such was one of the few people who had reliable information about what was really taking place across the whole Union. What he knew convinced him that reform was necessary, and as William Taubin shows in his biography of Gorbachev, much of Gorbachev's reformist streak was actually inspired by his relationship and conversations with Andropov. Nevertheless, as KGB chairman, Andropov had spent years collecting kompromat, compromising material, on Rashidov and the party apparatus of the Uzbek SSR. When Brezhnev died on the 10th of November 1982 and Andropov was elevated to the position of General Secretary of the USSR, he thus gained an ideal opportunity to tackle the corruption and lies that were built into the Soviet system. Rashidov's relationship with Andropov never resembled anything close to his chummy relationship with Brezhnev. In January 1983, just 2 months after he became General Secretary, Andropov invited Rashidov to his office in Moscow after a meeting of the Politburo. He verbally reprimanded Rashidov as a warning, but postponed his dismissal as leader of the Uzbek SSR until the end of the year. What Andropov had done effectively gave Rashidov an opportunity to resign voluntarily and avoid the embarrassment of being dismissed. But Andropov made it very clear that he was onto the Uzbek authorities and that he intended to punish Rashidov and his associates. Shortly after, in April 1983, Andropov decided to create a commission that would lead a criminal investigation into the Uzbek authorities rather than to challenge the powerful Uzbek elites in the political arena. The commission was led by 2 figures who would become infamous in the USSR, Telman Gidilyan and Nikolai Ivanov. Gidilyan and Ivanov each arrived in Tashkent the same month and began conducting preliminary investigations on the ground. At this point, it was not necessarily expected that the investigation would have statewide implications, but the scale of the fraud became clear very quickly. The investigations soon uncovered that every year, Moscow had been paying Tashkent for between 270,000 and 340,000 tons of non-existent Uzbek cotton, and that between 1976 and 1983 alone, this had cost the Soviet state nearly 4 billion rubles. Corruption on such a scale could only have been possible if the entire Communist Party of Uzbekistan was in on the scheme, and this meant that Rashidov had acted intentionally and systematically to make it happen. In a perhaps well-timed twist of fate, however, on the 31st of October 1983, Rashidov died. Of course, given the context, there is a great deal of speculation about the circumstances surrounding his death, and to this day it's not really known what happened. According to one version of events, earlier that day, Rashidov had received a call from Andropov in which he may well have realized that the gig was entirely up and he committed suicide. Others claim that he simply died of natural causes, but the truth is that we don't know and probably never will. In any case, Rashidov's 24-year reign in Uzbekistan had come to an end, and he was replaced at the top by Inamjon Usmanxhodzhayev. As the investigation continued in Uzbekistan, though, the findings of the early investigations were prompting what Riccardo Mario Cucciolla calls a spiraling dynamic that took the form of a kind of paranoid witch hunt. Indeed, as early as January 1985, 40 of the 65 Oblast Party secretaries, 10 of the 14 Obkom First Secretaries, and 260 city and rayon secretaries were removed from their posts. In addition, throughout the course of the investigation between 1983 and 1989, 800 criminal cases were opened, and over 4,000 people were found guilty on corruption charges and sentenced. 2 people were even executed for their role in the scandal. Overall, between 1981 and 1986, wholly 75% of the Uzbek Central Committee members were charged, and 50% of the nomenklatura was replaced. Later, it was uncovered that in 1983 alone, Uzbekistan was paid 757 million rubles for 981,000 tons of non-existent cotton, of which 286 million rubles disappeared in an unknown direction. Plain English, this meant that it went into the pockets of Uzbek officials. The personal fortunes of various figures was thus also seized. 10 million rubles in cash was found in the home of Lieutenant General K. Ergashev, for example, who was at the time the Uzbek Minister of Internal Affairs. He shot himself shortly before he was to be arrested. Another official, Argaipov, the first secretary of the Kashgaria Regional Party Committee, stabbed himself 7 times in the chest as plainclothes KGB officers surrounded his home to arrest him and seize his fortune. Although given the challenges of stabbing yourself in the chest 7 times at short notice, he was most likely murdered by the KGB. Unsurprisingly, the findings of the investigation held massive implications for the Uzbek SSR. Local party officials were replaced with placeholders from Moscow, officials and regular Uzbeks lived in constant fear of being arrested, and Rashidov's reputation was thoroughly ruined. By the mid-1980s, he was being publicly ridiculed and denounced for building a personalized system of Sharafradovshchina, a play on words referring to his personality cult. And in January 1986, he was officially condemned at the 21st Congress of the Uzbek Communist Party. One official at the Congress even commented that Rashidov was personally responsible for all deviations from the Leninist norms of party life, distortions in working with cadres, the spread of corruption, forgery, fraud, and serious flaws in the ideology and political life of the Republic. He cultivated an atmosphere of splendor and self-congratulation. So many key positions in the organs of the party, the Soviets, and agriculture of the Republic were occupied by relatives and people close to him. Now, through criminal accusations alone, over 22,000 people have been charged. The Uzbek SSR was thus thrust into a period of serious soul-searching and instability as the implications of Rashidov's actions were uncovered by the criminal investigation. But the discoveries of the investigation were also felt throughout the USSR as a whole. Indeed, even though we now know that Brezhnev was aware of and even endorsed what was taking place across the USSR at the time, the Soviets themselves did not quite realize the sheer scale of the corruption and lies, even if their existence was an open secret. This is evidenced by the fact that in 1985, Gorbachev, now General Secretary of the USSR following Andropov's and then Chernenko's death in 1984 and 1985 respectively, sent none other than Boris Yeltsin to Tashkent to investigate further. Yeltsin would go on to allege massive corruption in the highest echelons of power in both Moscow and Tashkent, effectively discrediting the Soviet state. He also supported the recommendation of investigators that Usmanxhodzhayev should be removed from his post as first secretary of the CPUZ. The Uzbek leader was eventually fired by Gorbachev in January 1988, and he publicly commented at the time that individuals and even whole territories were outside government control in Central Asia. By this point, the scandal had also prompted fury in the Soviet press, with Pravda publishing an article in January 1988 entitled "Cobras Over Gold," which presented key findings from the investigative team and revealed the whole picture to the masses. A year later, in January 1989, lead investigators Gleason and Ivanov similarly held a press conference in Moscow in which they presented their findings, conclusions, and the evidence they had collected. This caused another huge storm in the country. Gleason in particular openly referred to criminals in the Kremlin and suggested that the country was being run by bribe takers and careerists, as well as immoral and unprincipled intriguers who had turned the USSR into a mafia state. So, at this point, it would be fair to argue that the Uzbek Cotton Scandal raised serious questions about not only the legacy of the Brezhnev era, but the whole political economy of the USSR. Given this, how can we assess its impacts? Well, as we alluded at the beginning of the video, the Uzbek Cotton Scandal was just one event in a long list of crises that the USSR faced in the 1980s. Recall the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, the 1988 Armenian earthquake, gerontocracy, and the consequences of Gorbachev's perestroika reforms for the Soviet economy. The fallout from all of these developments was taking place concurrently, so it's hard to assess the impact of the Cotton Scandal in isolation. Did it contribute to the Soviet collapse? Almost certainly, though it was, much like the Chernobyl disaster, more indicative of the problems that would lead to the collapse rather than a cause in and of itself. One thing is for sure though, and that is that the Uzbek Cotton Scandal provides a very interesting perspective on the relationship between the Soviet Central authorities in Moscow and the republics, as well as what the republics were willing to do, or perhaps had to do, in order to survive in the Soviet system. For Uzbekistan though, the effects of the scandal are perhaps easier to pinpoint. When the investigations were closed in early 1989, Uzbekistan was in utter chaos, and interethnic clashes subsequently broke out in June of that year amid a fervor of nationalism across the Soviet Union. In Uzbekistan, this took the form of Mustaqillik, a theory of national development that emerged as an alternative to communist development. All of this would see Usman Hodzhayev's replacement, Rafik Nishanov, removed from his post after just 18 months at the top. He was then replaced by a relative outsider in the nomenklatura, Islam Karimov. Though Karimov initially presented himself to Moscow as a peacemaker and pragmatist, as the collapse of the Soviet Union became more likely, he became increasingly nationalistic and sought to rehabilitate Rashidov's image, celebrating him as a figure who created a prosperous Uzbekistan despite being stuck under the colonial rule of Moscow. Karimov would go on to lead independent Uzbekistan with one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world, right up until his death in September 2016. And the cotton industry? Well, throughout Karimov's rule, millions of Uzbeks were systematically forced to pick cotton without payment, prompting accusations of slavery and human rights abuses from all over the world. Though this state-backed program was finally outlawed in 2022 and Shavkat Mirziyoyev's government continues to take the problem seriously, many of the legacies built into the Uzbek cotton industry by Rashidov and Karimov remain stubbornly persistent. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss out on our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have dug a series of massive irrigation canals in order to grow more bell buttons so you can press those too. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.